In the spring of 2025, a California lawmaker introduced a bill that would have forced every device sold in the state to verify a user age before they could access the internet. Not just apps, not just websites, the operating system itself. Every boot, every login, For most users running Windows or Mac OS, this was a story about privacy and parental controls. For the Linux community, it was something else entirely. It was an ultimatum. Comply with a surveillance architecture baked into the kernel, or become illegal to sell in the largest consumer market in the United States. Within days, the backlash was unlike anything the open source world had generated in years. Developers, privacy researchers, system administrators, and ordinary users detonated into action. A single pull request in the systemed repository, the init system that runs beneath most major Linux distributions, drew over 900 comments in a matter of days. 900. For a piece of infrastructure most people have never heard of. And then something remarkable happened. The lawmaker who wrote the bill looked at what she had created, watched the open source community respond, and introduced a second bill to exempt them. California tried to regulate Linux out of existence. Linux did not comply, did not compromise, and did not go quietly. It pushed back. And the law blinked first. This is the story of Assembly Bill 1043, what it actually said, why it terrified the open source world, and how a community with no lobbyists and no marketing budget forced a California legislator to rewrite her own law. To understand why this bill hit Linux differently than it hit every other operating system, you need to understand what the law actually required. Assembly Bill 1043, titled the Digital Age Assurance Act, was introduced by Assemblywoman Buffy Wicks of Oakland. The stated goal was straightforward: protect minors from harmful content online. The mechanism was not. The bill required that operating systems sold on devices in California include an age verification layer, not a browser extension, not an app, the operating system itself. The layer between your hardware and everything you run on top of it. That layer would need to know who you were before it let you do anything on the internet. For a company like Apple or Microsoft, this was an engineering problem, a large one and a deeply troubling one for privacy advocates, but solvable inside a corporate structure that can assign a team to it, consult lawyers, and ship a compliant feature inside a product update. For Linux, the question was more fundamental. Who exactly was going to implement this? Linux is not a product. It is not owned by a company. The kernel is maintained by thousands of contributors around the world under the new general public license. Distributions, the packaged versions of Linux that ordinary users install, are maintained by communities, nonprofits, and small companies. Debian has no California compliance team. Arch Linux has no legal department. The Fedora project cannot be summoned to a Sacramento hearing room. And the deeper problem was not logistical, it was philosophical. The entire architecture of age verification, as described in the bill, required identifying a user at the system level. That means storing or transmitting identity data, or linking to a system that does. For a community built on the premise that your computer belongs to you and no one else, this was not a compliance question. It was an existential one. Linux did not come into being so that a government could decide who was allowed to use it. The irony was particularly sharp given who uses Linux. This is not a platform for teenagers sneaking onto social media. The audience that runs Linux, and the audience watching this channel right now, skews overwhelmingly toward technically sophisticated adults who chose this operating system precisely because it does not report to anyone. The idea that this demographic needed a government layer to verify their age to access their own machine was not just impractical, it was insulting. But the bill did not know that. And before the community could explain it, a developer made the mistake that turned a policy dispute into a global incident. The incident that crystallized everything happened inside Systemed. If you have been around Linux for any length of time, you know Systemed. If you are newer to it, here is what you need to know. Systemed is the init system used by the majority of mainstream Linux distributions. It is the first process that runs when your machine boots. It manages everything else. Debian uses it. Ubuntu uses it. Fedora uses it. Red Hat Enterprise Linux uses it. Between them, Those distributions power an enormous share of the world of servers, developer workstations, and desktop Linux installs. In response to AB 1043, a developer opened a pull request in the system repository on GitHub. The proposal was to add a birth date field to systemed user record format. The idea, roughly, was that if age verification was going to be required at the OS level, systemed was a logical place to store it, since it already manages user sessions and system state. The pull request did not go quietly. 900 comments arrived, not 900 upvotes on a post. 900 individual responses in the pull request thread itself, which is a number that developers who work in open source will recognize as extraordinary. Major pull requests in core infrastructure projects often receive dozens of comments, sometimes hundreds over weeks. 900 in days meant the entire open source world had its eyes on one thread. The objections broke into several categories. The first was technical. Systemed is a cross-platform init system used globally. Baking California age verification logic into it would affect every distribution and every jurisdiction on Earth, not just devices sold in one American state. The scope was absurd. The second objection was philosophical. Multiple contributors argued that the proper response to a law requiring surveillance architecture in an operating system was not to build the surveillance architecture. It was to refuse. Linux does not exist to implement the surveillance requirements of individual legislatures. The third objection was legal and structural. Even if you wanted to implement this, which most contributors emphatically did not, the GPL makes it extraordinarily difficult to add identity tracking features that would then be mandatory for all downstream distributions. The licensing implications alone were enough to table the idea. The pull request was reverted. The birth date field did not ship. But the incident had done something important. It had made the stakes visible to people outside the Linux community. Security researchers, journalists, and civil liberties organizations began examining what AB 1043 actually required. And the more carefully they read it, the more alarmed they became. The Electronic Frontier Foundation flagged the bill. Privacy researchers outlined what a compliant OS-level age verification system would need to collect and transmit. The picture that emerged was not of a child safety measure. It was of an identification requirement applied at the lowest level of the software stack, to every device, for every user, at every boot. The response moved from comment threads to legislative testimony. Open source advocates appeared before California committees. Organizations representing Linux developers and free software communities submitted formal opposition. The argument was simple. You cannot mandate a surveillance layer in software that is, by design, owned by no one and accountable to no one. You cannot sue the Linux kernel into compliance. You cannot fine a GPL contributor in Germany for not adding age verification to code that will run on a machine in Sacramento. The law, as written, was unenforceable against open source and catastrophic if enforced against distributions. It would have effectively banned the sale of general-purpose Linux machines in California, since no compliant version existed and no mechanism to create one was realistic on any legislative timeline. Assemblywoman Wicks was not unresponsive to this argument. Within the same legislative session, she introduced Assembly Bill 1856. The purpose of AB 1856 was to amend the Digital Age Assurance Act to exempt open-source operating systems from its requirements. Let that sit for a moment. The lawmaker who wrote the bill that threatened to regulate Linux out of California introduced a second bill in the same session to carve Linux out of the first bill. This is what legislative backfire looks like. Not a defeat in committee. Not a court injunction. The author of the original bill deciding, after the response she received, that the community she had accidentally targeted was right, and amending her own work. As of mid-2026, AB 1856 was still moving through the California legislature and had not yet been signed into final law. The exemption was not fully settled. But the trajectory was clear. The bill that would have required Linux distributions to implement OS-level age verification had been amended by the bill author before it ever reached a governor desk. What made this remarkable was not just the outcome, it was the mechanism. The Linux community has no lobbying arm in Sacramento. It has no PAC. It has no marketing budget or PR firm. What it has is engineers who can explain exactly why a proposed law is technically incoherent, developers willing to light up a GitHub thread with 900 comments, and a decades-long institutional commitment to the principle that software freedom is not negotiable. That principle is not always tactically convenient. The systemed pull request was opened in good faith by someone trying to find a practical path through a bad law. The community that rejected it was not being obstructionist. It was being principled. And the combination of principled refusal at the technical level and structured advocacy at the legislative level is what produced the result. The law blinked. The kernel did not. If this is the kind of story that makes you want to keep watching, this channel covers exactly this ground. The moments when free software, open source communities, and privacy-first tools run directly into the machinery of power, and what happens next. Subscribe now, and you will not miss the next one. If you are watching this channel, you almost certainly already run Linux, are seriously thinking about it, or have made the switch in the last year. The Windows 10 end-of-support deadline has pushed an enormous number of technically capable users into exactly this position. So this story is not abstract for you. Here is what California AB 1043 would have meant in practice for someone running, say, Linux Mint or Ubuntu on a desktop they built themselves. The bill, as written, applied to operating systems sold on devices in California. That language is important. If you downloaded a Linux ISO and installed it yourself on hardware you already owned, the compliance question was murky. The bill was primarily targeting OEMs, the manufacturers who ship machines with an OS pre-installed. But the practical effect on the distribution ecosystem would have been severe regardless. If a distribution wanted to be installable on a device sold in California, it would have needed to include the age verification layer. Distributions that refused would have effectively been excluded from OEM deals in the state. For community distributions with no corporate backing, the choice would have been to comply with something philosophically incompatible with their project, or accept being excluded from the fifth largest economy on Earth. That is not a hypothetical threat to dismiss. California market size means that laws passed there have historically reshaped product decisions made by companies that sell globally. The state emission standards changed the auto industry. The state privacy law, the California Consumer Privacy Act, changed how data is handled by companies with no California headquarters at all. A California OS-level age verification requirement would have created enormous pressure on every major Linux distribution to find some form of compliance or risk losing OEM traction. The open source exemption in AB 1856, if it becomes law, removes that pressure. But it also reveals something about how these fights work. The exemption exists because the community showed up, not just online, in testimony, in formal opposition filings, in the kind of organized, articulate, technically grounded pushback that legislators actually have to engage with. The lesson for anyone who cares about open source software, and specifically about the right to run unmonitored, unverified, untracked software on hardware they own, is that this will happen again. A privacy-threatening regulation will be introduced somewhere. It will be written by someone who does not fully understand what open source software is or how it works. And the outcome will depend, as it did here, on whether the community treats it as a comment thread grievance or a legislative fight. This time, they treated it as a legislative fight. And they won the first round. Here is a question worth sitting with. The systemed pull request was opened by someone trying to find a practical path through an unjust law. The community rejected it on principle. Do you think that was the right call? Or was refusing to engage a luxury the distribution ecosystem could not afford? Drop your answer in the comments. There is no consensus position on this one. There is a pattern to how governments and large institutions interact with open source software, and it is worth naming it plainly. The pattern goes like this. A legislature identifies a problem, usually a real one. It reaches for a solution, usually a structural mandate. The mandate is designed for the world of products and companies, where a law can point at a legal entity and require compliance. And then it hits something that does not work that way. Something that is not owned, not headquartered anywhere, not subject to a compliance department or a board of directors, something that is, in the deepest sense, just code that anyone can copy and no one can be compelled to change. AB 1043 hit that wall. The wall is the GPL. The wall is distributed development. The wall is the fact that the Linux kernel has no CEO to depose and no office to fine. What happened in California was not a fluke. It was a demonstration of something the open source community has always known, and that outside observers frequently underestimate. The architecture of free software is itself a form of protection, not because it is invisible to regulators. It is not, but because compliance with mandates that require centralized control is structurally impossible in software designed from the start to resist centralized control. This is why the audience that runs Linux is not just making a technical choice when they install a distribution. They are making a choice about what kind of relationship they want with the systems that run their computers, a choice about whether those systems answer to them or to someone else. California tried to add someone else to that equation. The community said no. The author of the bill said, after reflection, fair enough. That is not a permanent victory. The next version of this fight is already being drafted somewhere. But for now, the kernel is clean. The pull request was reverted, and the law that was supposed to regulate open source blinked first. That is worth knowing. And it is worth remembering the next time someone tells you that Linux is just a hobby operating system for enthusiasts. If you found this useful, share it with someone who still thinks open source software is a niche concern for developers. The decisions being made in Sacramento and in Brussels and in Westminster right now are going to shape what software you are allowed to run on hardware you paid for. That is not a developer issue. It is a property rights issue. And the more people who understand it, the harder it is to pass quietly. Like this video if you want to see more coverage of the fights that actually matter for people who care about digital freedom. And leave your take on the systemed pull request below. I read every comment.